So, welcome to, I think I titled the class, So You Want to Fit a Ship. This is the second time we've offered this. And the idea is not necessarily to make you a fitting expert or to explain how you fit every single ship in the game or every single fitting theory. That's not the point of this. We won't have the time to do that. What we're trying to do is just introduce you to the basic ideas of fitting. And then get you to the point where you can start exploring things on your own rather than having to experiment completely from scratch. So, what prompts us to run this kind of class? Well, a while back we saw a kill mail with a Galente ship. I don't remember exactly which ship it was, with with energy weapons on it. And
You.
right. so so right off the bat somebody said ew, because they know one of the basic premises of fitting ships is that you want to match the weapon types to the ship's strengths, and Galente ships don't have any
Hybrid
ships
turrets.
that are strong with energy weapons, right? so so it's that sort of thing that we want to talk about today. So, where we're going to start is by chatting about the empires and the different strengths and weaknesses of the different empires, because this is the most fundamental way of choosing how to fit your ship. Now, I'm assuming a couple things with this. I'm assuming that if you're watching this, you already know how to fit modules to your ship and unfit modules to your ship. I'm also assuming that you more or less know how to use the fitting simulator built into Eve, and that at this point in time, you're trying to hone your your skills at understanding how to make the right choices while fitting ships. For most of you in here, you're probably looking for a refresher or a just kind of an update on how things have changed over the years. But many of the people who are watching this recording may not be. So if I go back and explain some very basic things, you guys will have to forgive me. Okay. So we're going to start with Galente, since our corp primarily deals with Galente ships. Galente, you'll notice in the ship tree, which you can access from your Neocom ship and then ship tree, you can see a whole bunch of ships from the Galente line of ships. Right under here, you see Galente Federation, and you see some different tags here. These indicate what Galente ships tend to be strong at, and tend to have bonuses around, and tend to do well being fitted with. Hybrid turrets is one, right? Armor tanks. Galente ships are undoubtedly very strong armor tanks. Drones, they are the classic drone ships of the game. They also have some different ships with bonuses to warp disruption and sensor dampening. Sensor dampening is a hallmark of Galente rather than outright jamming. So these are the sorts of fits that we're going to see on Galente ships. The two or three that I want to draw your attention to, though, is hybrid turrets, armor, and drones. So every race has a primary tanking style. For Galente, it's armor tanking. So you would very rarely see a Galente ship with a shield tank, for instance. I have seen some Galente ships with shield tanks, but they're niche fits for a specific purpose, and they aren't very widespread. You also generally wouldn't see anything other than hybrid turrets as the weapons on the turret mounts on these ships. So you wouldn't see missiles, you wouldn't see energy weapons, you wouldn't see projectile weapons. You would just see hybrid turrets. And while drones are almost all of the races have ships that can use drones, Galente has ships that are specifically oriented towards drones. and have strong bonuses with drones. For instance, the Vexor, which gets a 5% bonus to hybrid turret damage, but a 10% bonus to drone hit points damage, and of course mining if you choose to take a Vexor mining. So when you're starting to look at fitting a ship and you have a ship in mind, the first thing that you want to look at is, okay, what is this line of ships strong at? And then what bonuses does that specific ship have? And I'll get more into that in a minute here. Caldari, if we were to look at Caldari ships, which are probably the second most popular ships with our corp, they're great at missiles. They are the preeminent missile ships in Eve. They're shield tanks rather than armor tanks. They use hybrid turrets as well as a secondary damage potential system. And they excel in electronic warfare, actually completely jamming targets' ability to lock. So Caldari has an entirely different set of fitting theories for them, right? So if you are fitting a Caldari ship, you would potentially see hybrid turrets on there because Galente and Caldari do share hybrid turrets, but you wouldn't see energy turrets or projectile turrets, right? You would, however, see missiles. And because missiles is one of the big strengths of the Caldari Empire. If we were to look at Amarr, what we would see is energy turrets are an Amarr thing. In fact, that is their primary weapon is energy turrets. They're very powerful with it. They're also armor tank rather than shield tank. They do damage with drones, and drones are a secondary damage type for them. They do a lot with energy draining and actually draining the cap out of other ships. And they're kind of instead of ECM or electronic warfare, their version of that is weapon disruption. So enemy turrets don't function as well when they're being weapon disrupted. And then finally, Minmatar. I saved them for last because they're a little bit of an interesting set of ships. Rather than being specifically shield or armor tank, it depends on the ship, and all of the ships have one thing in common, and that is that their tanks oftentimes rely on speed. So Minmatar ships are classic speed tank ships. They use projectile turrets, so I would never want to see hybrid turrets on a Minotaur ship. They have armor and they have shield tanks, depending on the ship. They do use missiles as a secondary type of damage. Some of their ships are missile ships, and some of them are projectile turrets. They do target painting and they do webifying or slowing targets down. So you'll notice that there's a pretty strong balance of types of damage and types of strengths here between the four empires, right? So the first thing when you're looking to fit a ship is identifying what empire it's in, right? And again, like I said earlier, one of the first mistakes I see, and I've seen people in our corp do it too, is say, "Oh, I've got a let's pick one out of the lineup here. I've got a Tristan. I'm going to put projectile turrets on that, right? When projectile turrets will work, but they don't take advantage of any of the strengths of Galente ships." So the next thing after you kind of identify the empire that the ship is coming from and what they're generally strong at, you want to look at what the strengths of a ship are. Right, these bonuses have a huge impact on how you're going to fit the ship. uh, so in this case with the Tristan, you get a 7.5% bonus per skill level of Galente frigate to your small hybrid turret tracking speed, right? So when we fit that, we're going to want to fit something that we're going to want to fit small hybrid turrets. It also gets a 10% bonus to drones, so we're going to want to make sure that we stick drones on there. And anytime there's a drone bay on a ship, we want to make sure it has drones in it. So let's say we want to fit a Tristan. let's go to simulate ship here, and we'll see all of these lovely things here that we can fit. If we're going to hardware, um, this brings up the whole list of everything you could possibly fit the ship with. I like fitting your high slots and your low slots first, or your high slots and your tank, and then we'll take care of the other stuff later. But in terms of the high slots, we go here and we know that small hybrid turrets have the advantage here, right? So I'm not going to select energy turrets. I'm not going to select projectile turrets. I want to look at hybrid turrets. Now for turrets, and actually for all types of guns and missiles, there is a long range version of that gun or missile and a short range version of that gun and missile. For hybrid turrets, blasters are the short range. They're the up close and personal version of the guns, the hybrid turrets, and railguns are the long range. So the trade off there is blasters do more damage. They have better tracking, but they're a lot shorter range. And railguns have a lot longer range, but they do poorer damage and have poorer tracking, right? So when we're choosing how we're going to fit, or which of these we're going to fit to the Tristan, we have to ask ourselves, what sort of scenario are we going to find ourselves in with this ship? And this is one of the big ideas behind fitting, right? What sort of scenario are we going to find ourselves in with fitting this? Am I doing this for missioning, where most likely distance is going to be more of a factor when sometimes, especially on some of the early missions, the ships spawn or the enemies spawn 20, 30 kilometers away, and I want to be able to shoot them fast and get their attention faster? Or are they going to, am I going to, if I were fitting this for PvP, it's much more likely that I'm going to be right in the middle of the action and have to and want the advantage of having as much damage as physically possible. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So in this case, let's imagine for a moment that we are fitting this to go into PvP, because PvP and PvE fittings are going to look fairly different. In this case, we would want blasters because we would want as much firepower as possible. Now you'll notice especially when it comes to guns and turrets, there are 500 billion different varieties of each gun. Mainly, there's three, right? There's the electron blaster, the ion blaster, and the neutron blaster. Now, all of these have different trade offs, and I'm not going to even pretend to be a specialist in all of the ins and outs of hybrid turrets. So, if you want to know something, I would take a look at the attributes and compare and contrast them. But one of the things that you tend to see with these is that they trade off. They trade off the optimal range. They trade off cap usage. They trade off accuracy fall off, turret tracking. They trade off all of these different stats. So when you're looking at fitting a ship in the scenario that you're going to be in, you end up wanting to be very careful about which one of these you choose to fit the scenario that you're going to be in. For this particular example, I'm going to take the electron blaster. Now you'll notice I picked the tier 2 version. Uh, this is this is important across the board, but particularly for PvP, you want to get into the tier 2 versions of guns and tanks as soon as humanly possible, because there is a distinct damage increase from tier 2 guns versus the tier 1, even the meta 4 guns. So tier 2 is something that you want to get into as humanly possible. And I just learned something here literally this week. For the longest time, I was under the impression that Omega accounts were unable to use anything tier 2. Turns out they can use tier 2 guns and tier 2 tank modules. So they are
You
fully
mean multi
capable.
accounts?
I'm sorry.
Alpha.
Alpha,
Did I
not
misspeak
Omega.
and say Omega?
Okay,
You
making
say.
sure I didn't miss something.
Yep. Yeah, I meant alpha accounts. Sorry about that. But yes, alpha accounts are able to use tier two weapons and tier two tank modules. So our alpha friends are just as capable of many of these fits as we are. So I'm going to put in tier two guns here. Now you'll notice right away that I can't actually fit these. I don't have the skills to. So this warning comes up telling me that and tells me exactly what I need to train, about 4 days and 17 hours worth of stuff in order to fit those, right? So if you were in my class earlier today, you would add those to your fit, the fit that you're trying to put into your skill queue, and you'd manage your skill queue accordingly. So we've got those now. If you can't fit tier twos, you'd want to find the Meta 4 variant of each of whatever you choose, and you can find the meta level down here at the bottom. So for this, the modal light is the meta 4. And what meta 4 means is that's just the highest tier 1 stats that you can get before you get into like special drops like officer or faction modules. So they'll be the best that you can get. However, Meta 4 only drops out of mission loot, so it's a little bit harder to get a hold of. You can't manufacture it, and you have to go and buy it off the market or find it being dropped via mission loot. Makes sense so far?
That's actually a good one. I didn't know that about
Yeah.
was what I put up on.
Yep.
Oh,
So tier one, you always want to go with the Meta 4. And especially in PvP, you want as much damage as humanly possible because you're trying to outlast the other guy who probably has tier two fitted on his ship, right? All right, so so let's say we've got those. That's great. You'll notice that this is very close range. The optimal range on these by default is 1,380 meters. So 1.3 kilometers. Fall off range is 3.18, so 3 kilometers away. That means you've got to be fast and up close and personal with this ship in order to actually hit them. Now, a little bit about optimal range versus fall off. At optimal range, your turret tracking is the best it can be. So you have the best chance at hitting somebody when they are at your optimal range. Anything less, and the turret tracking starts to uh, potentially become a problem, especially if they're moving fast. And anything more than that, you see decreasing damage up until the point of fall off range. Past the fall off range, you don't get any damage. That's too far, and you're not able to hit them at all. So you can still hit them up until the fall off range, but it's just going to be decreasing damage the closer they are to the fall off versus the optimal range. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. The fat boy only wants to hug somebody.
Now, missiles work a little bit different, and I'm not going to explain missiles right here, right now, because I think that would put us over our time here. But just know that they do work a little bit differently with some of the same principles, just with a slightly different mechanic. All right, so if we go and we stop filtering on the high slot, we're going to do our tank next, and the tank for a Tristan is going to be in your low slots. Armor tanks are predominantly in the low slots, so we're going to filter for our low slots. We're going to go through here, and we're going to find our hull and armor because that's what we got here. So a couple of interesting things about tanking. In tanks, you have two different types of each tank. You have an active tank, which relies on a repairer to actually repair the damage that's being done, and you have a passive tank, which usually relies on or a buffer tank, which relies on having as many hit points as physically possible to make sure that you stay alive longer than the people you're trying to kill, right? Now, there's some dangers in both of those, right? What's the danger of an active tank?
Not enough cap.
Going unstable and running out.
Yeah, not enough cap and going unstable and running out is big, right? And additionally, even if you are cap stable with it, if you're cap stable, that very likely means that you are not
Maxing it out.
you're not maxing it out, right? So you have a much weaker overall tank, and you're hoping that it's enough to keep you repped, right? Now, what's the weakness of a buffer or a passive tank?
Their DPS can simply outrun which.
Yep. Yeah, so if your total hit points are less than their total hit points, then odds are you're going to be the one that dies first, right? You really don't have any way to repair yourself. You're just hoping for the good graces of your Logi pilots to keep you alive, right? So when we're looking at fitting a tank, for PvP, generally speaking, and this is a general rule, not a specific rule. Generally speaking, in PvP, your engagements are going to be short. Now, that's of course that is not an overall rule. We know we've all seen the hours-long YouTube videos of giant fights in nullsec, right? But generally speaking, with the type of engagements that we'd be in, the actual time spent fighting is going to be rather short. So we tend to select passive or buffer tanks for our PvP fits. Now, it's important to note that both styles of tanking, both buffer fits and active fits, rely on something very important, and that is resistances. Resistances mitigate incoming damage and make it so that we have a better chance of surviving by having to repair less or by having less actual damage hit our buffer tank. So we're going to fit what is arguably, especially for armor tanks, the most fundamental uh, tank module that every armor tanked pilot should have on their ship, and that is a damage control.
Damage control 2 is a beautiful thing.
It is. Now, damage control 2 is not necessarily perfect for shield tanks.
Well, not for frigates, maybe, but yeah.
Yeah, well, and for frigates too, absolutely. But damage control 2 can add a tremendous amount of effective hit points to your ship. So let's take a look. Without the damage control 2, we're sitting at 2,462 effective hit points. Great, right? With the damage control 2, without adding any armor hit points whatsoever, that goes up to 3,380, right? And it does it by increasing our resistances. So with damage control 2, it adds the tier 2 version at least, which for any pilot, if you're planning on using damage control, get level or the tier 2 version as quickly as possible. It may actually save your life one day, quite literally. So for shield damage resistance, it adds 12.5% onto all the shield resistances. Armor, it's 15%, and hull damage, it's a whopping 40%. That's huge, right? So for instance, our 687 hit points in our hull, or our structure, that goes up to 60% resistance across the board. So that's a huge increase there, and especially in some of our larger ships than a frigate, it can add, in some cases, 100,000 or more effective hit points onto what you're doing. So this is a very very important module. Now the other types of resistance modules, armor hardeners are going to be your most common. You'll see the the different armor hardeners here. EM armor hardener if we wanted to increase our EM resistance. We can have a reactive one if we really want. I don't tend to use reactive hardeners a ton. Those are tend to be more for capital ships, but those are good too. We've got energized plating. I love me some energized plating. Energized plating, especially the. You guys can see I've been messing around with it, right? Energized adaptive plating is a very good one. You can see it already. Just putting that in there, it ups it by almost 20% across the board. We can also put specialized around EM, explosive, kinetic, and thermal. Most of my tanks for armor tanks are built with energized plating here. They're very good there. And then you can also add in resistance plating and energized armor plating or armor layering. Well, energized armor layering that's not resistance based, but you can do resistance plating. Resistance plating tends to be for very large ships where you've got a lot of extra low slots, and you can add those in. You've got a lot of hit points, so the extra little bit really helps. For most of our ships, we're probably not going to use resistance plating at this time. And so with this, you can see we added another 200 effective hit points on here. That's fantastic. That means that if we receive any kind of EM damage when we're in armor, 66% of that's going to be mitigated, right? And of course, only 39% is going to be mitigated on explosive. Which, by the way, if you're fighting armored ships, explosive does tend to be the weak point in their armor. So keep that in mind if you're ever up against an armor-based ship. Now, the other thing that we could do if we're creating a passive tank here is we could add an armor plate on. Armor plates actually add armor hit points into the pool. Now, for something this small, we probably would only want to use a steel plate or something like that. But with that, we went from what 3,400 to 5,200 by just adding that in, because it adds in a base number of hit points here, right? Which then, when you take into account all the resistances, bumps your effective hit points up substantially. So by using a combination of resistance modules and plates, we're actually able to increase our effective hit points quite substantially. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah, but Sal, armor plating decrease your speed?
It does. It does
Okay.
decrease your speed.
Messes
Armor-
with your inertia because of your weight.
Augment your signature?
Armor does not increase your signature, but it.
No, the plates.
I'm sorry.
The plates, because you make more mass, no?
No, it does not increase your signature radius. So here's our signature radius right here, 41 meters. And if we turn this off, that still stays the
Okay.
same at 41 meters.
Yeah, I thought
Okay,
the
got it.
signature was usually only affected by electromagnetic anything, engineering stuff.
Yeah.
Or burners? Or micro-warp?
Micro warp
Yeah.
drives affects your signature radius substantially. Yep.
Anything using power. The armor plating is static. It just adds weight and mass, and the mass is what
Yeah.
slows down your inertia, slowing your ship down.
Now, why is the mass important? And I think this brings up a really good topic because with our ships, the align time ends up being a very important stat. In fact,
Your get out of dodge move.
right. In fact, arguably, it's equal to, if not more important than the total speed of the ship in general. So if with this on, we've got 393 meters a second and 3.77 seconds to get into warp. With it off, actually, that it doesn't really change much on the top speed, but the align time goes down to 3.36 seconds. Why is that important? Well, when you are targeting a ship, you have a certain amount of time that it takes to target. And there are ships out there that you can actually get to target any ship, even a capsule, instantly, which means it takes approximately 2 seconds to target. You have it, and so if your line time is more than 2 seconds, in this case 3.36 seconds, that means that there is a 1.36 seconds in which somebody could target and warp scramble me and I can't get out, right? So when we look at a line time, especially for small ships like frigates, we want to get it oftentimes as close to that 2 seconds as possible if the purpose of our ship is to get in and out without being targeted, right? In this case, we don't really care about this guy because he's going in to fight. He's not going in to run away, right? So he's going to be in there blasting. So we'll turn that on. Now, the other thing that we can do to help our tank, particularly with regards to our effective hit points, is we can actually put rigs on the ship to help with that, right? There are armor rigs that will substantially increase the effective hit points that we have. Particularly,
Don't they have the negative of slowing you down though?
uh, everything has a negative. All armor rigs or all rigs in general do have a negative. In this case, it is max velocity that we have, right?
But you can learn make them shorter with skills, rig skills.
You can. Yep. So using the rig skills, you can make those shorter. What I'm going to show you here, though, is I'm going to show you two different alternatives for choosing tanking rigs, especially, huh?
10% drop. I think it's a 10% drawback.
10% with no skills.
Yeah.
Yep. So if I am looking at this, I'm going to make a decision about which one of these I want to buff up to increase my effective hit points. Right?
Thank you for the beer, honey.
You're very
Thank
welcome.
you.
Always happy to get
My
you.
mic was down.
Always happy to get you beer. Um, so we could take this two different ways, right? Based on our resistances, we could decide that, you know what, we actually have more, as a percent, we have more effective resistances at our structure level. Or we could say that because we have more hit points at the armor level, we want to increase our armor hit points. So the Trimark armor pump that increases our armor hit points at the expense of speed. So if we put this in here, we would see we would see a 20% armor hit point bonus for a up to a 10% speed decrease, right? And we could put three of these in there, right? So with those three, we get up to 7,200 effective hit points, and our speed decreases from, what was it before? Was it like 390 something to about 313? So somewhere around a 20-25% decrease in speed, right? Conversely, we could use our transverse bulkhead, which gives us more structure hit points, 25% at that, for a drawback of a smaller cargo bay, right? So if we added this in here, we don't get quite as many effective hit points. You notice because there were smaller structure hit points, but we don't have any of the navigation or speed issues. Right? That makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm following you.
So when
I'm
we're
learning.
looking at armor tanks, a lot of times you want to decide between those two things. Now, in the case of a Tristan, whose natural strength is going to be speed on account of a frigate, personally, I would probably choose the transverse bulkheads, simply because it doesn't get me quite as many effective hit points, but it doesn't reduce my speed at all, right? And in fact, what I might do is I might even say, if I want to go that route, maybe I'll just take the steel plates and the membrane off of here, and maybe I'll just choose to uh, buff up my hull points in general, right, and put on a reinforced bulkhead or two. Again, that gets us 889 effective hit points and reduces our cargo hold to almost nothing. But there's no difference there with the speed, right?
It doesn't influence the other stuff.
It influences the align time a little bit, yeah. So it does have an impact on the mass and the align time.
Lots of good combinations to do in there.
Lots of good combinations, and these combinations and the choices you make oftentimes will be what decides if you live or die, right? So I'm not saying that any of these fits are right and wrong. I'm just walking us through how we might choose, how we might think about our choices, and ultimately make decisions there. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yes,
So
sir.
so let's assume we go with the reinforced bulkheads, and we decide to just we're going to straight out hull tank this. Um, my fleet commander Mal likes to call this a hull surprise because they get through the shield and the armor, and they think that you're going to go down real nice and smooth, and then they get to the hull, and they have to slog through 60% resist across the board with 2098 hit points, right? Not fun. So if that's the case, then let's take a look at our mid slots and how we might manage our mid slots. Now, since this is a frigate, one of its big strengths is going to be that it's fast. In fact, with frigates, any of you guys who've ever flown a battleship trying to shoot frigates in a mission know that it's a
Right.
nightmare, right? And that has to do with what we talked earlier about how when
Right.
you're below the optimal range, the faster a target is, the harder it is for your ship's turrets to keep up, right? So we end up having a big strength to being small and fast. Now, my warning there is that don't take a frigate to a battleship fight because while you might be good at locking it down, you're not going to kill a battleship with a frigate, most likely.
He only needs one lucky shot.
Right. So
The last one.
right. So it's not that and I'll talk a little bit more about spheres of engagement a little bit later at the end of this, but I want you guys to think about in this case a huge component of a frigate's defense is going to be its speed. It doesn't have a lot of low slots to be able to fit a really hefty tank, right? I mean, even with all of this, the highest effective hit points we were able to get it to was like 7,200, right? There are ships that could take out 7,200 effective hit points in 3 shots, but speed mitigates damage too, and that's one of the types of tanking that we didn't talk about when we looked through the Empire.
Isn't that
Speed.
Mimitar?
Minmatar, yeah, Minmatar specializes in it, but many of the different empires have ships that can take advantage of speed tanks. Basically, the faster you're going, the harder it is for turrets, even at optimal range, to hit you. Right. So if when we're looking at its mid slots, we're probably going to want to choose things that make it go fast. Right.
5N micro or
Yeah, so there's two choices. There's afterburners and micro warp drives. So real simply for both of these, for afterburners you get a 1 MN, 10 MN, and 100 MN. In terms of sizes, one is roughly for frigates and destroyers. The 10 is for cruisers and battle cruisers. 100 is for your battleships. There's actually a bigger one, I think, for capital ships, but we'll keep it at that for right now. And then for micro warp drives, you got 5, 50, and 500. Same principles there. 5 is for frigates and destroyers. 450 is for cruisers and battle cruisers. 500 is for battleships and up. So if we take this, there are two different things that we need to consider. The first one is that our a micro warp drive will make it go the fastest. You'll notice that with the micro warp drive, we can get this sucker up to 2,734 meters per second. That blows tracking out of the water. There's not a whole lot that's going to be able to hit you at that speed. The downside to micro warp drives is it takes up an enormous amount of cap, and typically on most ships, not on all ships, but on most ships, if you have a micro warp drive and an active tank with an armor repairer, you're going to have a really hard time keeping that sucker cap stable, right?
Yep.
So the other downside of a micro warp drive is that it makes your signature radius much larger. So you'll notice we went from 41 to 246, right? So we what is that? That's
150%.
100
Yeah, bigger.
bigger than that, right?
Yeah.
It's multiple hundreds of a percent larger, and makes you much easier to target. Now, it's still hard to hit you because of the speed, but it's just a little bit easier to lock onto you and hit you because of the larger target radius, right?
Does the afterburner have that same signature increase, or at least that percent, or
That is
smaller?
that is the difference, right? With afterburners, if we put that on, you don't go nearly as fast. So in this, you top out at 1,013 meters per second. Still pretty fast, but you have you keep your original signature radius, and you'll notice it's much more cap stable, right? So typically in a PvP sort of application, we would use afterburners rather than micro warp drives, for the sheer reason that it's going to take a lot longer to target you, and you still get a lot of the speed without making it easier to hit you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well,
Yep.
Now, there are niche situations where that's not going to be true. Okay, for instance, anyone who was on our fun PvP room a couple weeks ago when we used a filament and went out to null, you're going to remember that that we had a lot of fun with a scythe who was using a micro warp drive to stay out of any of our range and make it impossible for any of us to hit it. So they're buzzing around in that thing while other ships came in and started picking us off. So there are instances where micro warp drives are actually preferable, right? But you just have to know exactly what the role of your ship and which to use in which sort of scenario. Now, there is one other downside to micro warp drives, and that is it's a micro warp drive. So it's using in lore, it's using the same energy, the same type of stuff as our actual warp drives, which means it can be disrupted and stopped with a warp. I think it's a warp disruptor that can shut those down. Somebody warp scrambler only. There we go. So it actually can be countered with that, whereas the afterburner can't be countered by that. Likewise, however, the afterburner's weakness is that since you're going slower, easier to catch up with you, and it's easier to web you. And webbing you with an afterburner is a death sentence, right? So there's pros and cons on both sides of it, and instances where both are appropriate. In this case, however, we're going to stick with an afterburner because that gets us the most bang for the buck, right? So that leaves 3 slots for us to do something with. Now you'll notice that all of these have been steadily filling up our CPU and power grid. Those are 2 important limitations on what we can fit. And if you are newer to the game, one of your first priorities should be skilling up the skills that increase your power grid in your CPU, because that can be one of the chief limitations on being able to fit a ship early on in the game. So when we're looking at this, I'm going to do these last two slots, and then we'll see if there's something we want to put in this top slot. But remember, it's okay to leave a slot empty. Not all the slots have to be filled if your ship is performing what it needs to. Since we're doing a PvP theme with this, most likely we would fit this guy as a tackler, right? So if we're fitting him as a tackler, we're going to want to fit him with a warp scrambler. So let's get him a warp scrambler. Let's do we can't do a warp scrambler 2, because if you look at that, our CPU is off the charts there. And we can't do a warp scrambler 1. So I guess this guy with the current fit is not going to be tackling anybody, right? That's where we can start looking at, okay, we need to maybe tweak our low slots in order to do some of these different things. So let's put a afterburner on here. We decrease the tank a little bit on here. I'm sorry, warp scramble on there. We decrease the tank just a tad in order to fit that. And now we're going to go back and figure out what we want to do there. So the other thing that we could fit onto here if we wanted to would be a sensor dampener. So a sensor dampener basically makes it so that people have to get closer to targets. Sensor dampeners, if you've ever run any missions against Serpentis, and all of a sudden you find yourself unable to target things that are 20 kilometers away, and it's just infuriating. That's because you're being sensor dampened. So let's see. We can fit the Captain Compact sensor dampener here, and that just barely fits in our CPU here. So we can put that there, and that has a 15% to the target scan resolution bonus, and a 15% reduction in maximum targeting range. And we can fit some charges in there too, which is kind of cool. All right, so we're almost done with this ship, right? We've got one more slot that we need to figure out, and I think we're probably just going to leave that high slot empty. We don't really need it for anything. We have a very tight fit here with our CPU, so we might actually end up deciding to go back and try our armor fit again here instead of these bulkheads. Because if you'll see that, the bulkhead actually consumes quite a bit CPU, right? So we're going to go back to our hull and armor, and we had some energized plating here, adaptive plating, put that there. And then I think we were going to look at some armor plates, and none of those work anymore. So let's see if we can't add anything else here. Nope, all of those are too much. All those are too much as well. Let's see if we can do any upgrades here. Can we do any upgrades? Nope, we're just on too tight of a fit here. So these are the sorts of trade-offs we end up having to make. In this case, if this guy is a tackler and we have him doing all of that, maybe we decide we don't want the sensor dampener, right? And we want to fit him with an extra tank instead, so he can do what he's built to do and warp scramble the crap out of something, right? We take a look there. We get our 200 plates back on there, which we can fit. And we are done with the basic fit. But we're missing some really important things. Can anybody tell me what we're missing off of this fit so far? Ammo?
Drones.
Ammo and drones, absolutely. So let's tackle drones first. Since we've got 40 M3 worth of drones. So for a ship this size, odds are we would probably want to be carrying light scout drones. So acolytes, hobs, hornets, or warriors. And can anybody tell me what the difference between those four are?
Primary damage type.
Different damage types, absolutely. So, if you are in a mission, for instance, if you're fitting a mission ship, you should be changing out your drones depending on, generally speaking, changing out your drones depending on the type of enemy you're up against. So acolytes, they do EM damage there. The hobgoblins do thermal damage. The hornets do kinetic damage, and that leaves warriors as explosive damage. Now, there's some other differences too in terms of like warriors have the best tracking speed and things like that. But the biggest difference is definitely their damage type. So for this, we'll probably just go with hobgoblins. You can add them in there and add them up to 5. That leaves me space for 3 more light drones. So if I wanted to include a second type, maybe some warriors for a different type of damage, I can do that, and I've got a full drone bay. Now, the other thing that you guys pointed out that we're missing is ammunition. So in the fitting screen, we can hit charges, and we can filter by clicking on that for exactly the type of ammunition that we want. There are a lot of different types of ammunition, especially for hybrid turrets. And the difference between them is damage, range, cap usage, etc. So for instance, antimatter is generally accepted to be the highest overall damage, but you have a range bonus of negative 50%. If we were to add this in here, we would see that we've got a pretty decent damage set there, but all of a sudden our optimal range went down to 690 meters. How easy do you guys think it's going to be to keep a target at 690 meters?
Oh, hug him.
Yep, you have to hug him.
Very difficult, right? Especially if we're traveling at 966.2 meters per second. That ends up getting very difficult, right?
Yeah, but it depends. What is the job of that at the moment of that ship? Actually,
Absolutely, and that
you
and
can.
and that is the fundamental question of everything ammo. What is the job that the ship needs to do at that moment? So generally speaking, you don't take a single kind of ammo with you. You take multiple kinds of ammo, and each one has a different range bonus, cap bonus, or damage, right? And each one has ultimately would have a different optimal range, a different everything. So when you're choosing your damage, especially in PvP, what you're going to ask yourself is, a, what range am I most likely to be fighting at, right? And B, am I going to need to fire at multiple ranges? For PvP, a lot of times, like for instance with our fleet or our standard thorax fit, we just include antimatter charges because generally speaking, we're just going to be getting in there and brawling. But for a ship like this that's fast and maybe tackling, we probably want a variety of different ammo types to support different ranges. So we'd probably do our primary fitting with antimatter. That puts us at 116.9 DPS. Again, you're not going to kill a battleship with that, right? And actually, because these are T2s, I'm not even going to do that. I'm going to use our T2 ammo here. So the null is the one that has a range bonus of 40%, but it does less damage. So you'll see here 113 DPS, but our range is now closer to the 5,000 range for fall off. Or our void, which has higher DPS, but our range is a little bit less, right? So we'd probably carry both of these to give us two different ranges to fire on. If you're in If you're in a battleship or battle cruiser, you're probably going to actually carry quite a few different types of ammo so that you can always have your target pretty close to an optimal range, right? Does that make sense for ammo and choosing ammo?
Mm-hmm.
Yep, clear.
This is
I
one
mean,
of
I
those
tend to
things.
carry just antimatter
I'm sorry?
just out of hand, but I mean, being able to swap them out is handy.
Yeah, yeah. So you can always default to antimatter or to void if you're on the tier twos, and that's fine. But especially if you're in PvP or you're wanting to run L4 missions really quickly, you want a variety of different ranges that you can shoot things at, right? So now we have a fully fitted ship, right? We can go and we can buy it, we can save the fit, share it with others, etc. So are there any questions about overall fitting theory and how we make some of these decisions?
So I got one question
Uh
just
huh.
about the rigs.
Yeah.
You ran the Trimarks, I know, but the fitting space is small. You actually bump one of those to a tier two for the extra dump, and then use that fitting space.
So actually, all those are tier twos
Oh, are
already.
they two?
Yep.
Oh, okay. It doesn't that okay. That's what I
Yeah.
was curious because I mean your fitting space. It looks like those are probably 50s. I don't have the. I'm on here. I can't. I'm not looking at my
Yeah. I
hit
think they
set,
are
but that's why I was
fifties.
curious. Because the other option is what's the difference? Because you have a stacked negative. Each one progressively you get less and less from it. Can you run two and then add the nozzles, which would increase
Yeah.
your speed and inertia, offsetting some of that?
Absolutely, you can.
Is it enough of a? Are you getting enough of a? Is the third one giving you as much as the increase in the inertia would? Does that make?
Yeah. So if I were taking a look at this fit, I would probably actually, knowing myself, spend about 45 minutes to an hour messing around with different fittings for it to find what I felt was the optimal fit. Um,
Well, I
and
guess
and some of you
I guess
guys,
I didn't phrase that right. I wasn't criticizing the build itself. My concern was the amount of fitting space
yeah,
because it looks like there's so much you're only using half of your fitting space. That's usually a telltale that there's more you can add or there are adjustments you can make to get a better. You can get more out of the build. I guess that's the way it used to be. I don't know if it's still as accurate. I mean,
yeah,
obviously, three type twos, you're only getting half of your rig fitting space, but it looks like something else would make that up, I guess.
yeah. I don't usually pay as much attention to the overall space as I do answering the question, what do I want to optimize around? And in this case, what I'm optimizing around is a tackler who I want them to be um, swarming a target and staying alive as long as physically possible, right? So
Mm-hmm. Yep.
we might get some benefit out of and some extra hit points by actually taking these three off and using armor instead of bulk heads, right? I think we found that was a little bit higher of an effective hit points. And we also
Mm-hmm.
might say, okay, well, what happens if we mix them? Well, it turns out not quite as much benefit there as when we just do that with effective hit points,
Well, no,
right?
I was curious about the nozzle
The
because isn't one of the negatives from your from the shield rigs is to your inertia and speed specifically? So I think it's one of the lower ones. It's usually the low friction something or other. Oh, there it is.
the dynamic
Low
fuel valve,
friction nozzle fits. Nope. Go down.
low
It's
friction nozzle
third or fourth.
joints.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but doesn't that offset your?
so it offsets the align time and the inertia, but it doesn't do anything for your speed.
Okay, but that was my question was the fitting space, and obviously it's not still
Yeah.
like you
Now,
wanted to use up all that fitting space, and obviously on lows, so that's
so
really more of
so I
a
would
battleship.
so I would not say that the goal is to use up all the fitting space.
Mhm.
That I
Okay.
would In fact, I would say the same thing with CPU and power grid. The goal is not to use up all the CPU and power grid or all the fitting space on the rigs. You are
Get what
not
you need versus what you can.
exactly. You are not
Okay.
leaving anything on the table by leaving space in the CPU and power grid. The only thing you might be leaving on the table in this case is by having a empty mid slot that you don't have anything used with. You could be leaving something on the table for that, right?
Yeah.
Um, but but generally speaking, when it comes to CPU, power grid, and the rig fitting, if you have extra space in those, good for you. That's not something that you're leaving anything on the table for.
Okay. That was more my question. I guess it wasn't. I wasn't directing it at this fit in particular. It was the overall.
Yeah,
How are we fitting it? And that was my. I'd always been on the use everything as long as you stay stable. If you're not using it, then you're not doing it right, and that explains why some of my fits have. Well, I've had to go out and salvage them.
yeah, yeah,
Can I break in there?
yeah. Go for it.
Listen about the fittings about the ship and stuff. We should not forget about one thing is what is the job of the ship actually? If you want to go do tackling stuff, you're not gonna take the fat boy here. You're gonna use other ship to do that. And actually, the fat boy, I mean the how you call him again?
The
The ship,
Tristan.
the Tristan, yeah. Um, it's actually fleet support, for the other guys, small things that come close to you, they should intercept those, keep the big ships protected. But if you want to go tackle stuff and the other ships, then you need other ships. You're not going to use a Tristan for it.
I mean,
It's
it.
because the fittings get difficult now. It's making it a turbulence about should I fit for this, but there is a point like now in the mid slot you can't fit anything anymore because it's not actually for the job to what you want to do with it.
Yeah. Yes.
There's something you should not forget neither.
So and that goes back to what we said at the very beginning of this. You want to play to ship strengths. You want to always be looking at what role you're trying to fit, especially with frigates. Each one has a distinctly different role, and in the case of jamming and scrambling, the Atron is a little bit better than the Tristan. But that said, there may actually be reasons why you might want to use a Tristan rather than an Atron. It all depends on your fleet makeup for PvP in that case, right? But always know what role, what job your ship is trying to do, and fit it with that in mind, right? So Mac, you're absolutely spot on. All right, so
Yeah, it makes you nuts actually. So much ships and so much things.
I know. All right, so are there any other questions or things that we can answer before we take a bit of a break here before our next class?
No, that was really informative. Thank you, man.
Yep.
All right.
The only thing I can say as a comment is you will need to have like two or three of the same ship with different fittings for the specific work that you want those ships to be on.
Yeah, or be able to refit it in the hangar. But yeah, absolutely.
Right. Hmm.
And the places should be sorted out in the fleet when you build them up. Wings, squads.
Yeah. So that I will leave you guys with this. Fitting theory is very important, and learning how to fit ships is very important. But when it comes to designing fleets, like we do for our PvP fleets, um, we're going to give you the fits. You don't need to fit your own ships or come up with your own fits. We're going to come up with the fits for you because uh, we're conducting an orchestra. We need a bunch of different fits to work well together and a bunch of different roles to work together, right? So,
Right.
so when we're out there doing a giant PvP fleet, and we give you guys a thorax fit, you don't have permission to go and completely overhaul that fit because you feel like it, right? You can usually when we give you guys those fits, the only thing that we want to see is if you can fit anything that's Tech 2 on it, fit the Tech 2 version of the Tech 1 fitting, right?
Right.
Because you're not fundamentally changing the fit that way, you're just making it more powerful. But don't go in and change a passive tank to an active tank or anything like that.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you guys for joining us today for this. I'm gonna hit stop on the recording here, and we'll see you guys here in about 48 minutes for our final topic of the day, which is clone management and attributes and all of that nice jazz.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.